My name is Allison Felis, and this is I'll Follow You, a podcast featuring light and lively conversations about film, music, and creative culture, coming to you from the People's Republic of Rogers Park on the far northeast side of Chicago. So, how's everyone doing this week, now that so many of us are sheltering in place? From the bottom of my heart, I'm wishing you and your loved ones health and ease during this supremely strange and unsettling time. I feel so fortunate to be surrounded by so many wise and compassionate friends who are helping me make sense of the wide variety of emotions that have been coming up around all the continued uncertainty in this ongoing coronavirus situation. I feel even more fortunate that I had the chance to speak with one of those wise and compassionate friends for this week's episode. Today, I'm incredibly pleased to be speaking with my friend, neighbor, and former bandmate, the poet Tony Trigilio. Tony is the author and editor of 13 books, including, most recently, Ghosts of the Upper Floor, published by Blaze Vox Books in 2019, which is the third installment in his multi-volume poem, The Complete Dark Shadows of My Childhood. His selected poems, Fuera del Taller del Cosmos, was published in Guatemala by Editorial Poe, translated by Bonnie Hernandez. He is editor of Elise Cowan, Poems and Fragments, published by Asada Press in 2014, and the author of Allen Ginsberg's Buddhist Poetics, published by Southern Illinois University Press in 2012. Tony co-edits the poetry journal Court Green and is an associate editor for Tupelo Quarterly. He is professor of English and creative writing at Columbia College, Chicago. Today, we discuss his origin story as a poet, the possibilities that get unlocked by asking a student, "Tell me more of what you mean by that," building bridges between the hemispheres of the brain, how playing drums professionally helped Tony unite his practice as a writer with his work as a scholar, and why the best art feels like a friend saying to you, "I'm going to tell you something, but it's hard to say." For more information about Tony, you can find him online at starve.org, and for complete show notes, including what amounts to a fairly robust reading list of Tony's favorite poets, please visit my blog, queenofpeaches.com. And now, my conversation with Tony Trigilio. Well, hi, Tony. Thank you so much for being here with me today. Not here in the ether, I suppose.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to be here, I guess, with quotation marks around it. I know we live like 4 blocks from each other, and if there wasn't a plague right now, it'd be great to do this in person. But I think, this is kind of like the shelter at home edition of the podcast, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, like week 2 of like the coronavirus special. Like I was sort of joking about it last week, and I feel like, do I even joke about it this week? I mean, not that I made light of it last week, and don't want to be weird about it. But yeah, it's strange days. I mean, because that was one of the things that I was going to say to you, was just that like normally I'm like really prepped and like, have like a whole host of like really insightful questions to like ask people. And like, I just have been so distracted with like the news and everything going on in the world that I didn't really prepare a bunch of questions, but I think that we will fare fine without them.
Oh, I think we'll be fine. And no, don't even worry about it. Like I'm excited to do this, and it's in the middle of a day, like so many days during the pandemic, where I go through so many mood swings. Like you were saying earlier about joking about it. Like there are moments when I feel okay enough that I can just sort of joke in a kind of escapist way, and then I'll go into like severe panic attacks, and so I don't, and then I'm fine again. So I think we're all rattled by it. So no, I think this will be great, and it's really nice to be able to talk about art making and creativity and the imagination. It's a way of even while all this is going on, it's a way of just kind of reminding ourselves that that those forces, those energies endure even during horrible times like what we're going through right now.
Well, and yeah, not to be like in times like these, art matters more than ever, but it's kind of true. And also, like, I'm like especially like glad to have you as a poet with me today, because I feel like, yeah, that's what poets do, right? Like, you guys like sort of metabolize the weirdness of the world and make it into your art. So.
I like that. I like that word, metabolize. I think we do. Yeah, yeah. That way, that sense of like trying to absorb what seems totally unsayable and then find a way to say it, and that's so much of what's going on right now just feels beyond language. And I'm like, okay, well, that's the stuff you get attracted to as a poet, the stuff that's beyond language. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, those are the spaces you swim in professionally.
Yeah.
So I've read so many interviews with you over the years, and I know you have known you as a human and a friend for many years. And one of the things that I was thinking in preparation for this was I don't know how much I've ever heard you talk about your origin story as a poet. I mean, it's like there's a lot of focus on sort of like what you're working on currently, and then especially in the Dark Shadows project, you talk so much about like early childhood memories, but like splitting the difference between those, do you have like an origin story as a poet?
Yeah, it's great to talk about that, because that's not the kind of question that usually does come up in interviews. It's usually, like you said, it's about like, what's your current work? What are you doing? That sort of thing. But yeah, my attraction to poetry, at the earliest, the bedrock level, was, first as a really, really young kid, like, maybe 4 or 5 years old, when I was just drawn to religious texts, I was raised Catholic. I fled Catholicism to Buddhism. I'm a Buddhist, but and have been for a couple of decades. But as difficult as my Catholic childhood was, in all the ways it can be difficult for folks who don't really take to Catholicism well. The one thing I did take well to were the things I took well to were the religious texts, and specifically, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. The poetry in those stories blew me away, and I wasn't calling them poetry. It was just like the stories themselves blew me away, and so that was one thing, and that was one, the idea that, kind of going back to the poetry getting at the unsayable, like, what could be more unsayable than spirit and spirituality? And then these religious texts were trying to talk about it. So that really moved me, and that got me really into like the thick of what language could do when I was barely learning language, basically. And then what really, I think, did it for me was my sister's Beatles records.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, my sister Mary, her name's Marianne. She's I'm doing the math. She's 19 years older than me, and I'm the youngest in the family. And so when I was like 6 or so, maybe 6 or 7, I discovered this trove of Beatles albums, and I didn't know, who are the Beatles? What are these guys? Who are these guys? They look like goofy kids on some of the albums. Then on others, they look like all the hippies that I am rocking around my neighborhood. What is this? But they really, listening to those Beatles albums just knocked me out. They were like The Fool on the Hill and Eleanor Rigby. Those were poems to me, and they still are. And so I think that was another avenue for just falling in love with language, but even more specifically, like when I say falling in love with language, like falling in love with what the feeling that language was giving me, poetic language, without even knowing that it could be called poetic language. So that stuck with me for when I went into school, was when I was in school, and because this was happening when I was in school. So this stuck with me as a young kid, as a elementary school student. And then one of the turning points as a poet, I'm laughing because we started the podcast talking about like panic attacks and the virus. I've just always been someone who's had a lot of anxiety, and in 4th grade, we had this teacher Ms. Omark, and it was like one of the greatest teachers I ever had. And she had us do a large, like I think a semester-long creative writing unit. It was so cool. It was just like heaven for me. And she brought in her hippie boyfriend to teach, who's a painter, and he taught us pointillism. I'm like, what the hell?
That's so cool.
I was like, who are you? And you know, can I follow you home, kind of thing, you know? So one of the things, she had us write a poem and just write about anything. And I just sort of looked inside, and I looked inside and found kind of like my freak out space. And it was this anxiety I had about tornadoes. And, you know, we where I was living, I grew up in a city called Erie, Pennsylvania. It's just like mid-size, you know, like 100,000 people. And it's kind of like, it's a very difficult place to live, really economically depressed. There's a lot of bleakness there for me. And where my family and I lived, next door to us, there was an elderly couple who hated children. And then on the other side next door, there was a family that was one member was an alcoholic, and it was just a very difficult sort of situation. And so when tornado warnings would come, we didn't have a basement, and I was like, where would we go if there was a tornado? The people on either side have basements, but we don't have a basement, and this petrified me to no end. So in Ms. Omark's class, I wrote a poem about my fear of tornadoes, and she liked it so much she wanted me to redo it on poster board, and I did it on poster board, and she taped it to her desk, and it was like my first publication. And so it was cool though, because it made me like that feeling I was getting from other people's language. It was like the first time I realized, oh, I could write something that produces a feeling in somebody else. And that was novel to me. That was really weird in a beautiful way. And I think it's just sort of like I got ensnared in poetry from all those things. And I've been ensnared ever since. Yeah.
Oh. And so, like, in those early poems, and as you were sort of finding your footing, I mean, so, you know, the Beatles, obviously a big thing in the Bible. So were you like trying to produce things in those styles? Like, were you sort of aping what you were reading, or did you lock into your own voice pretty early?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question, because like voice is such a, you know it when you hear it. It's such a hard thing to define. And when you said, did I lock into my voice? I was like, could I have had a voice when I was 9 years old? but I think I did. Yeah, I think I was locking into my voice because I wasn't writing about anything religious. But at the same time, I think I was channeling emotions I was feeling from the religious texts, and you know, especially especially the stories from the Christian New Testament. I think those really had an effect on me. But then also going back to the Beatles albums, I think the emotion of just the emotional sense of solitude and loneliness in The Fool on the Hill and Eleanor Rigby, really, that I think I started tapping into that emotion when I was writing, even though what I was writing in Ms. Omark's class were just, you know, I was just writing about pinball games and stuff like that, and then also, you know, as I'm thinking more about, I am thinking one of the assignments we had in Ms. Omark's class was she played Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and free write, what we call a free write now, and I had no idea that was, you know, an acid trip song. I don't know any of that, but I remember writing it, and I'll never forget. I wrote a dream transcript. You know, I transcribed one of my dreams, which had its own kind of trippy feel. So I think I was mostly, yeah, to be more like, to really directly answer your question more than I probably am. I think what I was doing was tapping into like poetry, and the Beatles were tapping into a deep well of emotion that not much else was. And so I was like trying to draw from that well. And I think from drawing from that well, no matter what I was writing about, it sounded like me, however I sounded when I was 9, but it sounded like me. And so that was like probably an early sense of feeling like, hey, that's voice. Yeah.
No, that's really cool. Yeah, I mean, that's awesome. I love the idea of just like Tiny Tony, like somewhere in the middle of Pennsylvania, just like being like, oh, wait a minute, like this force of of me, like from your own soul, was suddenly sort of unleashed by these factors more than something that was something that you were trying to copy. So that's really cool.
Isn't that great to think of? Like you could be that young, and something outside of you unleashes that force of who you are. It's just great to think that that art can do that no matter how old you are.
Because I mean, like for me, like as a writer and a musician, like I've always been a copier. I've always been like I'll do something in this style, or I like the way that this piece of music is unfolding. Like I want to sing like that too. So yeah, I'm always just interested in like how people give themselves permission to be themselves.
And I think imitation and copying is a major part of it for me too. Though, like that's a great point where you're saying like you hear someone singing and you're like, I want to sing like that. It's been that way for me as a writer and as a musician too. Like someone turns a phrase, a musical phrase or a written phrase, and I'm like, I want to do that. And there's something that comes, I think, from that desire to replicate what someone else is doing, and then you replicate it, but then it becomes, and then but it comes out as you. Like I hear your voice, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is how Allison sings. It's your voice. Even if in your mind you might be thinking, oh, I'm trying to replicate this other person who's really great, it still sounds like you. But maybe that imitation step is just an important part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it really wasn't even until recently that I sort of like was freed up around that, where like the idea that when you fail in replicating someone else, you're really just succeeding in being yourself. Like when I finally like connected that, I was like, oh yeah, okay, that's really that helps me trust myself a little bit more,
That's such a great way of putting it. Yeah, when you could say, oh, I'm failing in replicating this other person, but as you're doing that, you're succeeding in being you. It's great. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember when Brian and I, one of the first times we played together, that I don't know what we were talking about, but he said something to the effect of like, well, I'm always aiming for Sinatra, but if I hit Lou Reed on the way down, I'm doing pretty well. So.
I mean, you can't beat that. That's fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, on either end of the spectrum. Yeah.
Right.
Well, so I know that, like, so academically, I know that the Beat Poets are huge for you. So when did they come into this sort of nexus of the Beatles and the Bible?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can, yeah. Sorry, I'm doing my and yeah, and because I was thinking about when they came in, and yeah, I can pretty much pinpoint it. It was when I was a senior in high school, and a friend, I'm still friends with him, a friend of mine named Chip, who turns out, is also a writer and also a teacher now. He was really into punk rock, and he was the first person who turned me on to the Sex Pistols and the Dead Kennedys, and eventually the Dead Kennedys became way more important to me, but I had never heard music like that before. But to get back to the Beats, he was also, around the same time that he was turning me on to punk, he was the first person who turned me on to any beat writing at all, and it was Lawrence Ferlinghetti's poetry collection, A Coney Island of the Mind. And we went to the same high school. He knew I loved my English classes. I loved writing. I loved poetry. But I'd never read anything that felt so contemporary and felt so tender and felt so open-minded. And so I got really curious about him. And then I kind of went from that to On the Road, which got me more curious about the Beats. And then from On the Road, and I sort of, I knew there was this guy named Allen Ginsberg, and I knew there was this poem called Howl that everyone was talking about, or that all my friends said, oh, you like Ferlinghetti, you would really like Howl. But I really didn't sit down with Ginsberg until probably sometime in my first year of college at Kent State, and then once I started reading Ginsberg, he became sort of like the magnet that attracted all the other beat writers to me. It was like through him. He was the route into that.
And and that seems like the right time, because I feel like I first read the Beats in college, probably, because I don't think I read them at all in high school, and I think I read On the Road, and I almost felt like I was a little too old, like even as like a sophomore or a junior in college. I always felt like, well, if I had read this when I was maybe 16, it really would have like locked into me. And I don't know, maybe it's because I was a girl that it didn't hit me in the right way, since the work on Elise Cowan wasn't sort of rediscovered at that point widely. Maybe I would have had a different impression of the Beats if I had access to her at a younger age. But
sure, no, I think it does, especially On the Road. It has an appeal to young male wanderlust in ways that if I were female, I don't know if it would have appealed to me in the same way. Yeah, yeah.
although I do love my road trips, so that was why I was like, yeah, I'm gonna dig this. And then I was like, oh God, they're still driving. Like, when is this gonna end? Like,
I mean, can we do something beyond the road? Yeah.
like, yeah. Oh, they just keep going. Well, so when did that become a thing that you wanted to keep pursuing then? I mean, since, you said that it was Ginsberg that really turned you on to the rest of them beyond that. And so at what point did you sort of decide like, no, this is what I love. I'm going to stick with this.
Yeah, you mean that sort of like as a scholar writing about the Beats, like when did I decide I'm going to do that? Or
yeah,
that's right. Yeah, it's I came to that in a funny way. Ginsberg was, I had studied, as an undergrad, I'd take a contemporary poetry class and we'd read Howell, or we'd read an excerpt from Kaddish, the long elegy he wrote after his mother died. And I was like, and Kaddish kind of drew me in, but I was only seeing an excerpt. So it really didn't, wasn't grabbing me. And then when I got to grad school, at Northeastern University in Boston, my first poetry class, contemporary poetry class, with a professor named Guy Rotella, who became my advisor and a real mentor, like one of the most important mentors in my life. It was my first grad class, and we were studying contemporary poetry, and we read Howell, and I thought I was saying something profound in class. I raised my hand and I said, there's this, I'm really into the jazz elements of Howell, and I love jazz. And so I thought, oh yeah, I'm really onto something. And, and then like a really good teacher, he said, well, tell me more of what you mean. And I was like, I don't have anything more to say. I just thought, in my mind, I thought, isn't that good enough? But what was cool about that moment was, he was right. I needed to say more. It wasn't just like, oh, golly, it's jazzy, and I think I came off that way like, it's jazz, okay, well, what do you mean? Are you talking about like, kooky time signatures? Are you talking about what are you talking about? And you're talking about improvisation. Okay, well, how does that apply to a poem that's published on the page? What are you doing? So that kind of stuck when Guy asked me that question and I couldn't answer. That stuck with me, but I still didn't think I was going to write about that I was going to be, a scholar of Ginsberg. That's just, or of the Beats. It's just not. I wasn't against it, but it wasn't how I saw myself. And then much later, towards like after I was in my doctoral program, and I was to the point where you have to write your dissertation prospectus, and you basically have to figure out what the hell am I going to write about. I wanted to write about William Blake, who's also a really important poet in my pantheon, and H.D., Hilda Doolittle, who's also another really important poet in my personal pantheon. And Guy was my advisor, and we were talking back and forth, and he was like, I feel like there's a contemporary poet that would be really good for you to write about. And we just I couldn't figure, it was almost like a guessing game. And finally I said, well, who are you talking about? And he said, Allen Ginsberg. And I was like, it was almost like he gave me permission to do that. And then I had already read Ginsberg's collected poems and loved them. So I thought, well, I'm going to reread them thinking, could I sit with these poems and write about them and have something to say about them in terms of Blake and H.D. And I felt right away that I could. And then as it turned out, the dissertation I've later revised into my first book. And, it said something to me that would, reviews were good for the whole book, but people were mostly drawn to what I was writing about Ginsberg. And so that was sending me a message like, oh, I've got something to say about the beats, and that's pretty great because I like them, so this is good. Yeah. Yeah.
So how did, as you were sort of going through grad school and working on these projects, like how does the scholarship sort of play into your own creative practice, your own practice as a poet? How do you split those things, or do you split them at all?
I don't split them as much anymore. I let them bleed into each other if they're going to bleed at all, which I think is good. It's like it's a function of being more comfortable with myself. But in grad school, I think they were kind of split. I didn't want to drop either of them. It's just that I would, like it was like the hemispheres of the brain. I was building bridges between the hemispheres, but sometimes the bridges were rickety and they would collapse. I hop that makes sense. But
Yeah.
great. For a moment, I was like, oh, that makes sense to both my hemispheres, but I'm looking at my computer screen, so I don't know. So what I think helped a lot was that in my early in grad school, I was also playing really seriously as a musician. I was in the band Drumming on Glass, and we were doing really well in Boston, and gone on a tour, and put out a 45, an album. We were signed to Aurora Records, and it was like a really, it wasn't just like oh, let's just play once a month and drink some beers. It was just like it was a professional practice, and so there was a lot at stake, and I absolutely loved it. And that's when I started to see, like, okay, I have this part of myself that makes things, makes music, makes poems, and then this other part of me that likes to talk to other people about what they make, or talk about what other people are making. And I think it was playing music that helped me see that I really love both. And if you love something, you'll want to keep getting better at it. And so that's when I think I started to build the bridges. It was music that helped do that. But even it was hard at times in grad school. Towards the end of my dissertation, I remember there was like a year where I didn't really like the poems I was writing, and I just found myself editing old poems, and I had to kind of just be okay with that. But I wasn't, and I was upset. And I found a neighborhood writing group. These two people were teaching poetry and fiction workshops out of their home in Revere, Massachusetts, not far from where I was living in Boston. And they called it the Lighthouse Writers Workshop. And I was like, okay, I'll sign up for that. And they really opened up, opened up work that was inhibited in me, that I was like self-inhibited because I wasn't sure how to build those bridges between the hemispheres. They really pushed the right buttons, and they were really instrumental in helping me feel like, yeah, I can build these bridges, and I enjoyed both. I enjoyed the bridges, so run with the fact that you're enjoying it. And so they were. I owe them huge gratitude. Every time I see them at conferences, I remind them how grateful I am. They probably get sick of hearing it.
Well, and I love that you brought up music in the middle of that, because that was going to be my next question, was like, yeah, then, I think of you as, obviously, poetry is the main thing, and your academic practice, but then the third thing is really your music. And so, yeah, I love that was part of the thing that bridged those. So yeah, do you want to talk a little bit more about just like being a drummer and how that fits in with everything creatively that you have going on?
Yeah, it's hard to put into. I feel like it's gonna be one of those moments where I'll say, yeah, Alison Howell is just like so jazzy, and then you're question like, well, what do you mean? And I'll just stare at my wall. But no, I won't be like. There's a part of me that feels it'll be like, but it won't. And feel free to edit these moments of neuroses out. But if you want to keep them in, that's cool too, because it makes the conversation more real, I'm sure. But anyway, it's. I've often said to myself, or when this question comes up, like if in an interview or just chatting with friends, like I feel like I write poems like a musician, and I make music like a poet, and I'm not quite sure exactly what to say about that, other than I think that when I'm working on a poem, I'm hearing the trajectory of the line. I'm hearing it the same way I hear a musical phrase, and I shape to shape the trajectory of a line the same way I want to shape a musical phrase, and I arrange a poem on the page the same way. Like in a band, the same way I would contribute to arranging a song, or the way I'd envision the arrangement of a song. And so I think that's really helped me as a poet. To when I'm looking at the poem on the page, I feel like I'm looking at a musical score in a way. And so I'm not the best reader of drum transcriptions. I mean, musical reader. Like if you put a drum score in front of me, if it's not too complicated, I can probably read it and hear it in my head. But I'm not the best at it. But I'm okay enough at it that I look at a poem almost as something that's scored on the page. And then also, like when I'm playing music, when I'm getting together with a band and we're putting songs together, I'm keying on. Often I really latch on to the vocals when I'm thinking of like what to write as a drum part, and how the dynamics of a drum part should be, and how they should change throughout a song. I'm sort of cueing myself off the vocals, and it's not even the words themselves, it's mostly the cadences and the notes. And so there are times, like when we played together in Pet Theories, there would be times sometimes where we might play a song 15 times before I would realize, oh, that's the line that you're singing. Because I was keen to, the musicality of your voice itself, and figuring out those dynamics and where they're going, and anticipating where you're going, and using that to anticipate what I want to do. And so that's one way of thinking about where the musical part and the drummer, what it means to be a drummer and a writer. The other part's rhythm. Like I think I have a very good when I have the sense of rhythm in language. When I was much younger, and we would get, in English classes, we'd be taught iambic pentameter and trochees and spondees. I never liked the, it felt like, I never liked the sort of excessive rationalizing of rhythm. I was just like, no, you just feel it. You just know what an iamb is because you just feel it. Mm-hmm. I look back at it now, it's like, well, yeah, of course you were thinking that way because you were a drummer, so, so that's part of it too. And I also, like, one other thing, I think, being kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about the grad school story. Like at some point, I can't really nail down when it was, but at some point I realized that what I was doing as a drummer was more than just like technically learning my instrument. I think every musician, you realize this at some point. It's not just I'm learning technique, I'm learning songwriting. I'm putting songs together. There's this thing that's bigger than my technique. It's the collaborative, if you're in a band anyway, it's the collaborative effort. And when I realized that, I was like, what I bring to music in my spirit, in my psyche, it's the same thing I'm bringing to writing. And when I realized that, it was nice. It was a really nice feeling because I could start to see how all the things I love kind of are intertwined with each other in ways I only hoped for, but they were actually intertwined. Yeah.
Well, and one of the things that Kyla Roberts and I talked about in our podcast chat was, I was saying that, I love so much the humor in her writing, and she's like, yeah, that's the thing. She's like, getting to the laugh is the thing for me. And I said, by way of contrast with me, it's like I love humor, and like I think I'm sort of like a funny person, like in conversation with people, but like in my art, I'm very earnest. I was like, anytime I sit down to write or anything, everything is about like just love and emotions and feelings and whatever. So like, do you have sort of like a guiding light that you feel like twines through both the poetry and the way, the way that you approach your practice as a drummer? I mean, you sort of said that, in terms of, finding the voice, but is there like an emotional quality that you feel like, oh yeah, I'm doing this in drums and I'm doing this with poetry, and that's the same sensibility? Or do you feel like they're sort of, even though they inform each other, are they kind of separate?
Yeah, no, I think they're together. It's a great question. Like what's my guiding light? And I think in both instances, drumming and and writing, and especially poems, it's emotion. It's like trying to channel whatever emotion is the dominant emotion for a piece of music, a musical phrase, a piece of writing, a line, a turn of a phrase, an image. And so, but then the question is, like you're saying, like, does that emotion lead to humor? Is it earnest? Is it just like sober earnestness? And I'd like it to be any, like the range, whatever it needs to be. But what I'm really struck by, as you're answering your question, what I'm really, I guess what I'm really getting to, without knowing I'm getting there, is that maybe the guiding light is surprise. I want to be surprised by what I do when I'm making music, and I want to surprise myself, and I want to surprise myself as a writer too. And I think and so that surprise can sometimes be structurally, linguistically, phrasally, vocally, sonically, and then sometimes the surprise can just be like, oh, I didn't know I could put 5 words together like that. It could be really technical. Or look at that triplet I just did on the drums. Like, I've been trying to do that one for years. It just kind of came out of me, and now I could like build other musical phrases around that thing that I can suddenly do now. And so it's surprise, I guess. And the one difference, though, as I just thought of this, one difference might be too is that music is, for me as a drummer, almost entirely, like 95% of the time, it's collaborative. And writing for me, 95% of the time, I do collaborations with people, but 95% of the time as a writer, it's a solo thing. So that adds a difference. But otherwise, I think they come together in that way in terms of surprise, I guess. Yeah.
No, that's a really cool answer, because I was genuinely curious. Yeah, because I think of your drumming as so intense, and not that your poetry is not intense, but there's like an intense quietness to your poetry that that's always very moving. I mean, I think about, especially the passages in the Dark Shadows books where you talk about your mother and your family, and the gentle sort of precision that you come at those with. I mean, it's not gentle in terms of being wishy-washy, but the sensitivity it was so much of what I cherish about your work as a poet. And whereas in drumming, your furiosity as a drummer, is what is the hallmark of what I think of. You're sort of where you're inspired by Can and all these really propulsive drummers. And so it's cool to think of surprise as being the thing that unites those two. I love that.
I think it's great. Yeah, propulsive. Yeah, and I'm thinking of my early music teachers. One of my most important drum teachers, when I would watch his band play, he was propulsive, and I think I'm probably channeling that. But yeah, that surprise can unite the propulsiveness and the gentle precision. It's lovely. It's thank you for saying that. It feels great to hear that about the work I'm doing. Yeah.
Well, and before we go too much further into our chat, I would love for you to read something for us here, if you're up for that.
Sure. I could. Let's see. I think maybe I'll read something from my new book, and it's. I'll need to say a little something about the project. I mean, I know you know the project. You've seen me. You're one of those folks who, like, sometimes when I describe the project at readings, I think, oh, these people who know me, they've heard this before. They've heard me tell this whole story, but I'll make it brief. I promise.
Well, it's like telling the story of Christmas. You hear it every year, and it grows in richness every year.
Right, exactly. So when I started to do this poem, I saw this star in the sky, and these three guys came, and they said they were wise men. And I'm like, nah, you just, you're just here to bug me. Yeah. So my version of Christmas is, so I'm gonna read a prose poem from my new book. It's called Ghosts of the Upper Floor. And it's the third volume in my multi-volume experiment in autobiography called The Complete Dark Shadows of My Childhood. And in like a brief synopsis of the concept, and a person can read any this is book 3, but I set up each book as a standalone book, so like someone could jump into book 3 and not feel like they're missing anything. What I'm doing is I'm watching every episode of the old soap opera that used to air in the late 60s and early 70s on ABC, the old soap opera called Dark Shadows. And Dark Shadows was like any soap opera, any daytime soap opera. People fall in love, they fall out of love, they have really tight melodramatic close-ups, and everything is really over the top, emotional, and grave and serious. The only difference is Dark Shadows, the main character was a vampire named Barnabas Collins, and it had the show had vampires and witches and a Frankenstein monster, and at one time actually a bride of Frankenstein. And when I was a child, really small toddler, like even before language, and then when I learned language, I would watch soap operas with my mother every day because she was a stay-at-home mom, and the soap operas stuck with me in their own ways, but Dark Shadows really did because of the vampire. Barnabas Collins was his name, and Barnabas just I had incessant nightmares about him, and I would go to sleep at night with my shoulders hunched, thinking this would protect me from being bitten by Barnabas. And then I'd wake up the next morning and I'd look in the mirror and there were no vampire bites. So I was like, okay, it works, and this is how much this guy affected my life. So I'm watching, because he had such an effect on me and the show had such an effect on me, I'm watching every episode of the show. I'm writing one sentence in response to each episode. And then I use that sentence as a leaping off point for writing about past memories or writing about stuff that's happening in the present. So it's like each sentence becomes an autobiographical lightning rod for me. And that's pretty much all I need to say, I think, about the project. There are other characters who come in and out, and the characters kind of you don't really need to know who they are except to know that Barnabas is the vampire. There's a character in what I'm going to read, a woman named Maggie, but she's someone the vampire's in love with, but that's probably all you need to know. And this segment I'm going to read, it's a prose poem it's an homage to my brother, Carmen. It's one of my sweetest memories of him, and it's also a really smelly memory too. And it also has our mutual friend Gene Kannenberg in it, and my wife Liz. With Liz and Gene Kannenberg at a throwback screening of Planet of the Apes, released in 1968, 6 months before Maggie's overwrought episode 608 introduction, one man has discovered that both sacred and profane love can leave you completely alone. Dark Shadows, the Joy Division of daytime TV. First time I've seen this film on the big screen since 1974, age 8, a Planet of the Apes marathon, all 5 movies, all day, at the Warner Theater, a plush Art Deco cinema in Erie, Pennsylvania, where I begged my brother Carmen to take me with him and our 2 cousins. He relented only because my parents forced him to. And during the intermission between the 3rd and 4th films, Escape from the Planet of the Apes and Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, I went to the men's room with them and, self-conscious that I didn't know how to use a urinal, watched how my brother walked up to an empty one and imitated him, pulling my penis through the fly hole in my underwear. But I didn't adequately maneuver it from the flap, and for some reason didn't understand you must point your penis at the urinal, causing me to streak my underwear and jeans with my stream. I felt lucky. No one saw it. Assumed I'd gotten away with my accident, until I felt a huge damp spot on the right inner thigh of my jeans as the 4th movie began, and by the end of Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, the odor had become inescapable, at which point I noticed my brother watching the movie turned 3/4 away from me. He endured it and never said a word. even though he must have realized his reward for taking me to a 5-movie marathon was the acrid smell of urine for the last 2 films. 3 hours of screen time plus intermission.
No, thank you for reading that.
Oh, it was great. Thanks. It's always nice to remember how nice my brother was that day. He could have made my life miserable because of that. I mean, I begged him to take me to the movie, and then I pissed myself. And he was just the kind older brother, and just didn't say a word. Bless his heart.
Well, and like, so where does the bravery come from to tell that story? Because it's like, I would like never, I mean, I shouldn't say that, but like, I just, like, I would feel, I mean, even if it was in the past, that many years in the past, I would feel like I can't tell that story. And I love that you're just like, well, this, I mean, I guess this is what I meant sort of at the beginning about like metabolizing these strange experiences and literally turning them into poetry.
Yeah, the bravery. It's a couple different things. I think, like, on one hand, it's the nature of this project, where somewhere early on, I decided, wow, I'm going to be writing about myself while I'm living, and that means like what's happening in my life goes in the poem, and it's kind of like it's a diaristic poem, and so, I mean, not kind of, it is. It's a diaristic poem. It's a memoir. It's autobiographical, and so I was just like, well, that means the stuff that makes me uncomfortable has to go in there as much as anything else. But that's easier said than done. Like, you can say that, and then you can be like, oh, but I don't like the way I look in that story. I'm going to mask it. I'm going to hide, But the other part of that is, like, it might be tempting to mask it, but I just find that the art I'm drawn to the most, I'm thinking mostly of poetry, but I think there's a way to translate this into music and certainly into film too, and prose, poetry, and fiction and nonfiction. But like, especially, I'm just thinking of poetry right now. The poems I'm drawn to are when the poet really is vulnerable and exposing sensitive or maybe even embarrassing material. And it's something that I notice in myself when a poet does that. I just feel like I'm even more drawn to the poem. And it's something I say to my students a lot at Columbia College, where I teach. Like, you're just like, sometimes you feel at that very moment where you want to swerve away from the sensitive material. That's the moment where, as long as you're comfortable writing about it, that's the moment where you want to really dig in, because that's where a reader is going to dig in with you. But again, that's easier said than done, because, we're not always, especially when we're talking, like, if you're talking about trauma, like, you're not always ready to write about stuff. But if I find if I'm at least 60% ready, that's enough, I guess. But it's you kind of figure it out as you go along. Like, there are times when I'll be revising a poem and I'll just be like, why isn't this working? I feel like I've got everything there that needs to be there. And then I'm like, well, what's not there is I've drawn a curtain around myself in the third stanza, and I need to open up that curtain, and that's when the poem's going to open up. So, yeah, but it's also like, noticing how I respond as a reader, the way I respond when those curtains are opened up, and that's when I get really excited. Yeah.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, and I've had to, not that I'm as prolific as you are, but yeah, in my own writing that my blog Queen of Peaches that I started, I don't know, a while ago now, 2013, I guess. Yeah, that was a big thing for me, was that I was like, okay, I was so used to writing sort of criticism, self-styled sort of bloggy criticism on my previous blog, where it was all about like film reviews and music, shows that I'd been to, or, whatever stuff that I was consuming that I wanted to talk about. And, there was inevitably I was going to talk about personal stuff, but like, I was really challenging myself when I started that project to sort of be more, not use somebody else's art as a screen, like you said, not use it as something to hide behind, to really sort of go into, just being transparent about my life and my feelings and things that I'd been through. And I don't know how successful it was, and I guess that doesn't really matter because it's all process in some sense. But where was I going with this observation? Yeah, just that, knowing that that's what I respond to in other people's works, like, I think that is what bolstered my own sense of like, okay, you have to be honest about these embarrassing, quote unquote embarrassing moments, because that really is what draws people into into work is the vulnerability. Yeah.
It's like we the way we it's such an important part, and I really mean this. Could sound, I don't mean this in a pretentious way, I mean this really seriously. Like, it's an important part of our shared humanity. It's like, I'm thinking of when and you're on your blog, like when you've written about your family, and when you were you found the cassettes of your father's band, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
It was really like intense, serious, emotional reflection and remembering, and it just, I think that sort of thing it just drew me in, and it draws readers in, because then we were like, oh yeah, I here's my version of that in my head, and I'm relating to it. It's kind of like when you're hanging out with a friend, and they say, oh, I'm going to tell you something. It's really hard to say. Or something, I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone before. It's just like, how do we usually react? Like, we're all ears, like, oh, tell me. And we're like, the curtain opens. And I love it when I see that in other people's writing too. The equivalent of, I'm going to tell you this thing and it's hard to say. And then my reader self is like, oh, please go ahead. Yeah.
Well, how do you work with that, like, as a teacher? Like you said, you were saying that you do encourage, students to get 60% of the way there. And so how does that, I would love to hear you talk more about, as a poet, being a teacher as well.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely love teaching. I feel like, I can't even begin to. Lucky isn't the word for it. To that my job, the thing I do for work, is to just hang out with younger people and help them make art. I mean, because it doesn't get better than that. And so I think that's part of it. Is just that I'm really excited to go in and sort of like look at the classroom as my job in the classroom is to create the conditions for students to make art, and sometimes that's helping them through sort of like self-imposed writer's blocks, or talking about vulnerability, or turning them on to new writers that I think can push certain buttons in them. Like, this student over here might need to read. This student over here might be writing really wildly experimental poetry on the order of like Harriet Mullen, one of my favorite experimental writers. And I'm like, well, this student is just, she's got the experimental stuff down, but what would she do if she started reading someone who's more formalist, like Tom Gunn? And so sometimes it's trying to identify, like, this student is left-handed, let me give them something right-handed to do. But then other students, like, trying to identify, well, this student is just starting to figure out their experimental chops, and so maybe they haven't read Harriet's work, and so read this, or read Bernadette Mayer, and here's someone who's right up your alley. So part of how I do it is just trying to identify where students are at, and then try to figure out, and it's intuitive, but like anything, we do it long enough, and you hopefully, one hopes, your intuition is honed. And when I'm doing well, my intuition is honed, and when I screw up, then I'm like, well, you got to get better, But like, when I've got it going right, in that ability to identify, does a student need to need guidance to sort of deepen the thing that they're already doing, or do they need guidance to turn them in another direction so that what they're already doing, they're going to deepen it anyway? I mean, I don't know if that's making sense. I think the key is, like, I go in not trying to turn the students into something, but I go into a classroom and I try to identify what they're all doing, what they're into, what they're trying to do, and then just try to create the conditions to heighten the thing that they're trying to do. And then I have confidence, if you do that, they're going to just keep getting better and better, because they're going to just be excited by the changes and the surprises that are happening in their own work. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm trying to, I don't know how rational that sounds, because so much of it's intuitive.
No, that makes complete sense. And actually, what I was thinking about as you were talking through that was, you sort of mentioned how solitary the poetry writing can be when you're writing your own poems. But I think one of your strengths, and one of the things that does unite, the teaching and the music playing and the poetry, is is this sense of being part of a collaboration, whether that's collaborating in a band. And I think in these recommendations to the students, I mean, you're really sort of like collaborating with this pantheon of poets that you're able to sort of like call in their voices and evoke their voices and say like, almost like a a prescription, saying like, I'm prescribing you this poet because it's going to bring out this aspect of your work and of your writing and of your sensibility. And I love thinking of you as being in this pantheon of poets.
I like the way they like thinking of it as a prescription. I've never thought of it that way, but that's a great image for it, because I'm also thinking like when I go to my doctor, I trust my doctor when I'm told, oh, this prescription will be good for you. I'm going to prescribe this. There's just this trust that the doctor is reaching into the pantheon of medical science and prescribing something. And it's the same in the classroom like that, building that trust so that the students can think, okay, this is a suggestion. This prescription is a suggestion. And Tony isn't expecting it to look a certain way. He's just like giving me this, and there's some kind of alchemy. I'm going to do the student can say, I'm going to do the alchemy, and we're going to see what happens. And they know that I'm really excited to see what's going to happen, and we don't know until they do it. So there's also a sense of spontaneity and chance to it, because we don't know what they're going to do, which I guess is so much about collaboration, because I do think the classroom feels collaborative. And when I get together with other poets who are friends of mine who are looking at my own work, I feel like it's collaborative too when we look at each other's work. So I guess collaboration is a big part of that. Yeah.
Well, and that's the perfect segue, because I was going to ask you, like, if you would just like to sort of shout out some of your cohort of your favorite living writers who, either people personally and that you work with on a regular basis, or anyone else out there who's doing cool work that you're just jazzed about.
Oh my God, yeah. The good. I'm glad I'm at home, because if I forget something, I can look at my bookshelf. But because like my pantheon seems to always change a lot. But I guess to try to narrow it down, one of my closest friends is one of the greatest poets I know, and one of the greatest readers of poetry I know, David Trinidad. And he's just, in terms of surprise, like, he's always trying to surprise himself with new projects and surprise his readers. And he's also, like, when he reads my work and when we're mutually reading other poets, I don't know if I know anybody who reads poetry at the level of sensitivity and depth that David can. This is quite amazing. And
I mean, David blows me away. Yeah, I mean, his the poems about his years in New York. I just, all of his work is phenomenal, but that book especially just is really, really special to me too. So I just love the idea of you guys like shooting the shit and talking shop, because he's really remarkable.
Yeah, then that book is amazing. That book is like he's working with some really sensitive subject matter and calling things out, but always doing it artfully, and it's pretty great book. With David and I meet once a month and critique work, and that's a collaborative exercise that's been really vital to my work, and it's something I really cherish. So David would be one. I'm thinking of some other writers, mostly like folks I've been reading lately, and people I turn to a lot. I mentioned Harriet Mullen. She was the poet who, when there was a period in the early 2000s when I felt this was kind of a false way of looking at poetry, where a lot of poets I knew, you were either experimental or you were narrative. And I was like, why is there an opposition between these two? The two can work together. You can be an experimental storyteller. I didn't really like that. And Harriet Mullen's work was among the first that I felt like I could be at home experimentally and narratively with her work. And she's also really, she can be political too, like really intensely political. So she's someone I return to a lot just to remember what I love about poetry and making poems and reading poems. Same goes for George Oppen. He's another poet who I turn to just remind me what's great about the art form, remind me why I love the art form. There was a period, I think it was like a 20-year period, during during and after the McCarthy era, where he just stopped writing poems and went to Mexico. He just was like, this poetry is not adequate to the shit that's going on in the world right now. And then he came back, and I think the book he wrote when he came back to writing poetry was the book of Being Numerous, which I think won the Pulitzer. I might be wrong about some of those facts, but he came back in force, and I like that push-pull he had with the poem too. Like it was his major art form, but then there was a period where he felt it just wasn't adequate, and I love that about him, and I love his work, of course. Of the poem of Being Numerous is one of my favorite poems of all time. And then H.D., who I've mentioned, Hilda Doolittle, Allen Ginsberg, William Blake, Sylvia Plath, Bernadette Mayer. I think probably if there is a patron saint of the Dark Shadows, if there are patron saints of the Dark Shadows, I guess we plural, patron saints of the Dark Shadows project, one would be David Trinidad, because he was doing a book of haikus in response to the soap opera Peyton Place that helped me figure out what I wanted to do. Working with those poems helped me figure out what I wanted to do with Dark Shadows. It was a direct inspiration on the Dark Shadows project. And then Bernadette Mayer's Midwinter Day Bernadette Mayer is kind of a patron saint for this. Also, her book Midwinter Day is it's a book-length poem about everything she did on the winter solstice in 1978, and just this way that she brought in autobiography and the outside world. She's a patron saint of so much of what I write, I think, but especially that project. I could look at my shelf and go on for another hour, probably. Yeah.
Well, since we're getting ready to wrap up here, if you want to shout out any projects that you have coming up in the future, and I would love to have you read another piece if you're willing.
Sure. I guess the biggest, in terms of projects I'm working on right now, I'm in the middle. So the poem I read was from book 3 of the Dark Shadows project, Ghosts of the Upper Floor. I'm about 1/3 of the way through book 4, and so that's a big project ongoing. That's going to be an ongoing project for my whole life. But that's one of my big ongoing projects right now. I recently finished a manuscript that I'm starting to shop around. You've heard poems from this a while ago, but I actually really did just decide there are no more poems for the book. And this was a manuscript. Right now it's called Proof Something Happened, and it's a book of documentary poems about Betty and Barney Hill, a couple who in 1961 claimed that they had been abducted by aliens in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and I kind of trace their experience. Whether they were abducted or not doesn't matter so much to me as like what they felt and what happened afterward. So I really got to a point where I have no more poems, so I'm now starting to circulate that.
No, those are some of my favorite poems, and I'm like super, super excited to see them all finally bundled together and ready for the world.
They're bundled. Yeah, they're bundled and ready, and so we'll see where that goes. And then I'm also working on another manuscript of standalone poems, just sort of like regular lyric autobiographical poems of everyday life, not project based, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I'm also in the process of trying to find a publisher for a new edition of Elise Cowan Poems and Fragments. We talked a little bit about this earlier. The book I edited of poems by this beat writer, Elise Cowan. It's sort of like she was unknown, and this book brought her into a more public consciousness. And the press that published it, Asada Press, recently was defunded by its host university, Boise State University, and so the press has gone under. So I'm looking forward to finding a new press and then writing a new introduction. And I'm also serving as a consultant on an independent film that's being done about the life of Elise Cowan. It's called On the Offbeat. So I have a lot of fun every time the filmmakers have questions about her life or her work. We talk on the phone, or we meet, or we email. So that's been a fun project.
And I'm so bowled over by the work that you did on that. I mean, that collection, I really hope it finds a new home and finds a wider audience, because her work is so incredible, and all the work that you did to bring it out is remarkable. And I think, like I was saying earlier, for anyone who's sort of alienated by some of the macho aspects of beat literature, she's such a corrective to that, and her poems are just so remarkable. And a couple years ago, I took a tarot course online with Camelia Elias, who's a wonderful academic and tarot reader. And she, at the beginning of the course, she said, I want everyone to pick sort of a poet to sort of be. I forget the word that she used, but sort of like, the person that you can sort of turn to on the spirit realm to inspire you as you're reading the cards in a poetic way. And I was like, man, it's Elise Cowan, and so she was sort of my guiding light through that tarot course. And so that's a whole other conversation that you and I could have at some point about tarot and poetry. But yeah,
love to. Yeah. And I'm so glad to hear that. And her poems, I mean, that project, it's like we were talking about solitary work and collaborative work. Like, I was just alone with that project for several years, and I can't even put into words how gratifying it is to hear what you just said about Elise as your guiding poet for the tarot. Like, to hear that, to hear stories like, people saying, like you were saying, there's the masculinized energy of the beats, and then there's Elise Cowan, and you just work alone with something. You just don't know how it's going to respond. But people have really taken to her poems, and it took a half century for her to get an audience, because her work was submerged. But it's better late than never. And then
and maybe the times were finally ready for her.
I think that's part of it, right? I think that's it. There was. I mean, I don't know if. That's the best way of putting it. This was the right era for her. And then all the other these projects, like talking about them, they're just, I call them projects, but they're art making things I love to do. That's the best way of putting it. But I think everything we do, we can call a project. But my most recent musical project, I'm playing with the band Bummer Deluxe, and we're a 4-piece, and kind of a mix of some sort of a little bit of punk, a little bit of I'm not good with musical labels, but like Americana, punk. I come from, obviously, we've talked like sort of a krautrock background too, so I inject that kind of propulsion into it. But that's a lot of fun, and we went into a studio in December, and we need to remix or finish the mixes, and obviously, with everything going on in the world, we're not doing that anytime soon. But hopefully sometime this year, when the world recovers, we'll have an album out. So
do you guys have recordings up on YouTube or anywhere?
Not yet. No, we don't have that. Like, we have these rough mixes that we have like a whole list of things we want to do with the rough mixes, and we're just itching to get back in the studio.
No, because I was going to say I'll put it in the show notes and link it out for people, but they'll just have to stay tuned.
I wish I did. Yeah, but thank you. Yeah. So that's it's a lot of fun. I mean, I feel lucky that I can juggle a lot of fun things, and so and gratifying projects. Yeah.
That's excellent. Yeah.
I have a poem. Should I go to finish with a poem?
I would love for you to finish with a poem, yes.
Okay. I know that sounded so weird. So I have a poem, yes. So you do, Tony. Will you read it? Sure. Yeah. So this is a poem called The Gig Economy. It's not connected to any project. I thought of this, I finished this last year. Every time I used to hear the phrase the gig economy, I would cringe, because I grew up poor, and I just the gig economy always felt like, I think it is code for, hire people and deny a living wage and benefits to them. And it's even more of an ominous phrase now, with so many people out of work and unable to even do their gig economy jobs because of the virus. So this seems, when I was thinking of poems as we were talking, I was like, wow, the gig economy seems even more apt now than it felt last year. And so anyway, I'll read it.
Much like Elise Cowan, you're finally catching up to the times, yeah?
I guess that's it, right? Yeah, it took some time, but this helps me catch up. Yeah, except there's no virus in it, but we couldn't have anticipated that. All right, so the gig economy. The first thunderstorm of a snowy spring. I close my eyes, let the downpour do its work. Rainfall knows how to take over a room. Barack Obama and I are leaning against the driver's side of my car, the two of us watching workers stretch a long gray hose from a Chicago water and fire restoration van into my neighbor's building across the street. He looks like he did in 2004 when he toured my gym, another stop on his run for U.S. Senate. Jogging on the treadmill, I smiled back at him when he returned my nod. He shakes his head in the dream, preoccupied. His sleeves are rolled up, as they always were in the Oval Office. The stressed out presidential gray hair is gone. He exudes the gravitas of a person who once ruled the free world, back when that was our quaint name for it. We used to be capitalists, he says, arms crossed, arching his back against the car window. Now we're all lobbyists. I have no idea what he means. Then he walks away. Everything in my neighbor's home is flooded, and now Obama is gone. Over the rumble of water hoses, I want to say, yes, I've read 4 things you need to thrive in the gig economy, and 4 reasons why the gig economy will only keep growing in numbers. I don't think he can hear me. I want to tell him about my cousins, afraid of their father, the drunken gig economy failure whose roadside produce stand wasn't productive enough to survive. But Obama's a block away, walking toward the lakefront. Corrugated hoses shake, pumping out floodwater. We didn't call it a gig or an economy back then. It was a wagon, trundling on warped struts, and my uncle fell off. We were raised to hate everything that wasn't food. He simply didn't sell enough.